Initiating a flexible opening, the knight ventures out, aiming to control central squares without immediately committing pawn structure. Mirroring white's knight development, this response immediately contests central influence and prepares for pawn advancements. Challenging black's central pawn structure, white claims space and prepares to contest the d5 square. Embracing the fianchetto, black aims to control the long diagonal and build a solid pawn structure, preparing for kingside castling. Developing the knight here immediately fights for central squares and prepares for kingside castling, keeping options open for further pawn expansion. Unlocking the g7 bishop's long-range diagonal immediately shapes the center and prepares for queenside development. Solidifying the kingside structure, g3 prepares a fianchetto for the bishop, aiming for a flexible pawn center and long-term queenside pressure. Securely tucking the king away, black prioritizes safety and prepares for queenside development. Completing the fianchetto solidifies white's kingside pawn structure and prepares for potential central expansion. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies black's center and prepares for potential pawn pushes, while also connecting the pieces harmoniously. A bold claim for central space, aiming to pin down black's development and prepare a kingside pawn storm, while simultaneously inviting a confrontation that could open lines for white's bishops. Solidifying the center and preparing to challenge white's queenside pawn mass, this develops a piece that can now eye the long diagonal and potentially support a future e5 break, establishing a flexible pawn structure that allows for various middle game plans. Suddenly, the center solidifies with pawn territory pushing forward, creating a locked structure that demands long-term maneuvering and opens avenues for queenside pressure, as white claims a space advantage. The knight scurries to safety, seeking active squares and challenging white's central control, while simultaneously preparing to contest the important e5 square, a key outpost for any aspiring knight. Sacrificing the knight for piece activity and opening lines towards the king's haven, this decision immediately disrupts black's solid setup, forcing a tactical reevaluation and potentially creating weaknesses in the pawn structure as black recaptures. Reclaiming central space with this pawn recapture immediately opens the d-file for black's queen and rook, offering them active participation. The pawn chain on the kingside is now broken, potentially creating targets. However, it also concedes a slight space advantage to white's pieces, particularly the bishop on g2, which now has clearer diagonals. The central tension has transformed from a blocked pawn structure to one with open lines, demanding careful piece placement from both sides. Casting into safety, white seeks to consolidate after the pawn exchange, tucking the king away behind a reinforced pawn wall while preparing to activate the rook. This seemingly routine maneuver, however, lays the groundwork for future kingside pressure, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's pawn structure should the center remain locked. Developing the knight to d7 aims to reposition it, perhaps to c5 or even e5 again, creating a more flexible central presence after white's pawn push. It also indirectly supports a potential e6 pawn advance, aiming to contest the central squares and ease the pressure on black's kingside. Solidifying the center, this move aims to establish a commanding pawn presence and restrict black's knight activity, potentially preparing for an expansion on the kingside or a controlled central pawn push. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's central control and seeks to dismantle the pawn chain, aiming to open lines for active piece play. Opening the e-file is a daring gamble, immediately challenging black's central pawn structure and aiming to exploit the newly created weaknesses around the f5 square. This aggressive pawn thrust, while seemingly giving up central control, aims to disrupt black's harmonious piece development and potentially create an outpost for white's pieces on the now open file, forcing black into a reactive posture. Opening the g-file, black embraces a sharp, unbalanced position, deliberately sacrificing pawn structure for dynamic counterplay against white's slightly cramped queenside. Opening the f-file now creates immediate attacking potential against your castled king, but simultaneously weakens your own pawn structure and potentially leaves your d5 pawn vulnerable. Instantly, black fortifies their central pawn chain, establishing a commanding presence on e4 and daring white to challenge this newfound foothold. This aggressive pawn push significantly restricts white's minor pieces, particularly the dark-squared bishop, and opens up potential avenues for counterplay on the kingside if white commits too heavily to attacking the e4 pawn. The move sacrifices a tempo, of course, by re-advancing a pawn that had just been captured and recaptured. But in doing so, black gains valuable space and prepares to potentially mobilize their queenside majority or support an eventual f-pawn advance. Unlocking the diagonal for the queen's bishop, this placement prepares to challenge the e4 pawn and potentially create a pawn storm on the kingside. Developing the knight to f6 repositions it to a more active central square, from which it can influence the e4 pawn and potentially attack the white king's defenses, while also preparing to contest control of the d5 outpost. Consolidating central control and preparing for kingside expansion, the bishop relocates to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses and influencing the d5 outpost. The pawn sacrifice on e6 opens up the dark-squared bishop and creates dynamic counterplay, though it does leave black's kingside slightly exposed to potential piece pressure. This repositioning of the bishop aims to exert pressure along the a7-g1 diagonal, potentially pinning the knight on d7 if black isn't careful, and simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn chain. Embracing the open d-file, black strategically concedes the pawn to liberate the bishop and activate the rooks, a bold concession aiming for dynamic counterplay. Unleashing a pawn storm across the center, white initiates a daring gambit to pry open the position and disrupt black's king's safety, demanding an immediate and precise response from the defender. Black finally unleashes the thematic pawn break, aiming to destabilize white's central grip and potentially open lines for the queen's bishop. This pawn push is a bold attempt to seize initiative after a period of positional maneuvering where white's pieces looked poised to dominate. It's a gamble that forces white to confront the newfound tension in the center and decide whether to accept the pawn or try to consolidate. The move fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses but also opportunities for active piece play if black can navigate the immediate complications. Unlocking the c-file, white immediately aims to exploit the newly opened diagonal, potentially creating pressure against black's uncastled king if it remains exposed, or more immediately, challenging control of the now critical central files. Black regains pawn equality and opens a crucial diagonal for their bishop, potentially creating counterplay against white's central pawn structure and influencing the queenside pawns. White's queen departure clears the central files, initiating a strategic shift toward an endgame where pawn structure and piece activity will dictate the rhythm. Reclaiming the rook on its original square prepares for the inevitable struggle for control of the open d-file, a critical artery in this unbalanced material situation. Re-establishing central influence, this rook maneuver aims to activate the last major piece, seizing control of the open d-file and preparing to contest black's own central pawns. Emerging from the queen side, the bishop seeks active squares, eyeing the open c-file and the potential for queenside pressure after the exchange of queens. Instantly recognizing the potential for a kingside assault, white repositions the bishop to an attacking square, eyeing the vulnerable pawn chain and preparing to coordinate with the rooks and knight for a direct assault on black's castled position, simultaneously reinforcing the e4 pawn and adding pressure to the d5 square. The black king, previously tucked away, now ventures forth, a bold decision seeking active participation in the unfolding middle-game skirmish. This maneuver signals a proactive intent to shore up the e4 pawn's defense and potentially join the fight on the kingside, aiming to create counterplay where none was immediately apparent. It's a gamble that, if successful, could redirect the flow of the game towards black's favor by activating a piece often relegated to a passive defensive role. Activating the knight through the center provides a more dynamic central presence, potentially supporting a kingside advance or preparing for a rook lift to the 7th rank to exploit the open files. Re-establishing the bishop on its ideal diagonal after the exchange of queens sets the stage for potential king's side pressure and prepares for a coordinated attack along the semi-open c-file, where black now has a solid pawn structure and the rook is well placed. A calculated attempt to activate the king's safety on the king's flank, subtly preparing for potential pawn advances or a safer retreat if the center opens up further. Embracing the open files is key for black, and this pawn push strategically prepares to challenge white's control of the d-file, potentially opening lines for the rooks, and even the queen if it were still on the board, while simultaneously creating a barrier and offering a pawn sacrifice that aims to disrupt white's harmonious piece placement and gain critical space for black's pieces to maneuver. Striking at the doubled pawns, white clears the kingside and hopes to exploit the resulting pawn structure for black. This maneuver aims to dismantle black's pawn chain, potentially creating weaknesses around the king. The idea is that after recapturing, black's pawns on the e-file will be permanently doubled and isolated, a classic target for positional pressure. White might be looking to open lines for their rooks or bishops, or simply to gain a tempo by forcing black to spend time dealing with the pawn situation. Consider the long-term implications for piece activity. This exchange could significantly alter the pawn dynamics and open up new avenues for attack or defense. Reclaiming the king from a precarious central position, the monarch now ventures towards the queenside, seeking a safer haven amidst the ebbing tactical storm. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure is the main idea here, aiming to create a stable defensive barrier against black's potential advances, and to prepare for future queenside expansion should the opportunity arise. A daring rook sortie into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's pieces and potentially exploit the open d-file. Securing the open file with the rook now initiates an endgame where white's pawn structure, though slightly compromised, offers good central control, while black's doubled pawns on the d-file become a potential long-term weakness. The pawn's advance, though seemingly simple, unchains the rook and immediately challenges white's centralized control, aiming to exploit the open d-file and create immediate threats against the compromised white king. Reactivating the bishop by repositioning it to g2 offers a fresh perspective on the central files and aims to challenge black's seemingly consolidated pawn structure around the d2 pawn. Recognizing the imminent pawn structure transformation, black immediately seeks to exploit the open d-file and prepare for the endgame's characteristic maneuvering. Re-establishing activity on the central files is paramount. NC immediately targets the d2 pawn and prepares to contest the open d-file, a vital highway for piece mobility. Black's initiative is now centered on securing the passed pawn by challenging the central control and creating a dynamic pawn structure. Shifting the bishop to the f1 square looks like a subtle repositioning aimed at freeing the d-file for the rook. It's a quiet maneuver, perhaps preparing for a future rook lift or a defensive posture, contrasting with the more dynamic play that preceded it. The focus now seems to be on consolidating white's pawn structure and potentially supporting a central advance or a kingside initiative after the initial tactical fireworks have subsided. This is about finding a more harmonious setup for the remaining pieces. Reclaiming the d-file with the rook, black asserts pressure on white's isolated pawn and prepares for potential infiltration into white's territory. Reclaiming the open file, the rook now aims to contest the d-file's control and potentially disrupt black's centralized king by creating threats on the 7th rank. Challenging the established pawn structure on the queenside, black aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and open avenues for counterplay, even if it creates some structural imbalances. Seeking to anchor the knight defensively and prepare a potential repositioning, this maneuver initiates a careful restructuring, aiming to shore up the weakened light squares on the queenside. A bold gambit to reclaim material and open lines, aiming to activate the rook on the newly created diagonal, though it risks leaving the king exposed to potential discovered attacks down the c-file if white can reorganize. Securing that open, a file now offers a fresh avenue for queenside pressure, potentially isolating the advanced black pawn and creating long-term structural weaknesses. Asserting presence on the open file, the bishop immediately targets the weak pawns and begins to coordinate with the rook, aiming to exploit the exposed nature of white's king position. Finally, the bishop finds a commanding position, eyeing the unprotected rook and forcing a difficult decision. Exchanging that bishop clears the way for your rook to become significantly more active on the open c-file, threatening to infiltrate white's weakened queenside pawns and creating imbalances that can be exploited in the ensuing endgame. The pawn storm on the queen side has dissolved, leaving white with a structurally dubious pawn on c4, a lonely sentinel in no man's land that now demands immediate attention rather than contributing to any coordinated attack. Seizing the open file now presents a clear opportunity to disrupt white's pawns. Seizing the initiative, the knight reroutes to a more commanding central square, creating a pivotal outpost that will soon dominate the d-file and potentially threaten black's vulnerable pawn structure. Harnessing the open file, the rook embarks on a pivotal infiltration, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and create immediate threats. Instilling immediate pressure on the queen side, the rook now occupies the only open file, directly threatening the isolated pawn and forcing a defensive reaction. Sacrificing the exchange is a bold choice, aiming to simplify into a winning pawn endgame with the rook now centralized and a clear path to promote on the queen side. The passed rook, a fearsome new presence on the 7th rank, immediately starts probing weak points and restricting the opponent's activity. The king ventures out from its previously safe haven, seeking to participate in the endgame's dynamic possibilities and potentially shore up weaknesses. Asserting control over the open file and disrupting black's pawn structure. Reclaiming the bishop's rightful place on the long diagonal now applies pressure to the weak d2 pawn, a tempting target that might draw the opposing rook away from its crucial defensive post. Snaring that bishop presents a clear path to simplifying into a winning rook and pawn endgame by isolating the remaining black pawn structure. Bringing the bishop back to its more active role offers a defensive screen for the rook and eyes the weak pawns on the kingside, while preparing to potentially contest the open c-file or support a kingside push if the opportunity arises. Gaining control of the open file is paramount. Now, the rook can disrupt black's coordination and begin an assault on the vulnerable king. Injecting activity on the kingside, this pawn push attempts to create a connected passed pawn or at least disrupt white's pieces. King's safety has become the paramount concern as the monarch ventures into enemy territory. This check forces a crucial defensive decision. The black king, exposed by the early pawn push, now finds itself in a perilous position, directly in the path of white's advancing rook and king, making active defense a crucial, albeit difficult necessity. The king steps out from behind the pawn shield, aiming to rejoin the fray on the kingside and offer support to its embattled rook. The pawn's advance creates a new potential target on the queen side, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and possibly open lines for the rook. Opening the g-file with this pawn grab immediately liberates your rook and sets up an aggressive attack on the enemy king, forcing black to react defensively and preventing any comfortable regrouping of their pieces. Sacrificing the bishop for such a critical check opens up immediate threats against the white king, exploiting the newly created weaknesses around it and forcing a defensive scramble. Sacrificing a pawn to activate the rook on the 7th rank, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create potential mating nets. The bishop repositions itself, aiming to shield the king from further threats and prepare for a potential pawn push that could activate the queen's side. A determined effort to regroup the monarch, seeking sanctuary from the persistent g-file threats, while implicitly acknowledging the compromised pawn structure that now leaves the king exposed. The king's daring excursion finally forces a check, creating a momentary stalemate in the pawn structure and presenting a fleeting chance to disrupt white's consolidated position. The monarch finds sanctuary in the center, a bold, perhaps desperate, bid for safety as the pawns crumble. The king's desperate scramble across the board now faces a fresh wave of checks, forcing a difficult decision for white regarding pawn structure and piece activity in this sharp, unbalanced endgame. The king shuffles back, a defensive maneuver that concedes crucial tempo and allows black's rook to solidify its advanced post. Pushing the king into such an exposed position on the 2nd rank, after a sequence of checks, desperately seeks any available respite, hoping to force a perpetual or at least survive the onslaught of the opposing rook. The king embarks on a risky promenade, seeking refuge on the kingside while ignoring the encroaching enemy. The king, exposed and vulnerable, finds a momentary respite from immediate danger, forcing the rook to reposition and abandon its aggressive push. The king retreats to safety, a sensible decision given the perpetual check threat that black's bishop poses. The bishop sacrifices itself to force the white king onto a square where it can be relentlessly harassed by the rook, creating decisive mating threats. The king drifts back to its original square, a silent acknowledgement of the ongoing patrol and the lack of immediate threats, while white consolidates its rook on the second rank, preparing for a potential regrouping behind the passed pawn. A desperate attempt to reignite some activity by forcing the white king to an even more exposed square, but it comes at the cost of the c-file, which will now fall under complete control. Repeating the king's journey once more sacrifices tempo and allows black's rook to continue its imposing march across the board, solidifying its central presence. Black's bishop retreats, a defensive recalibration after its excursion. This maneuver seeks to re-establish a stable pawn structure and prepare for potential kingside action by consolidating the bishop's influence, although its prior position offered more immediate threats. The question remains whether this passive posture truly addresses white's growing pressure along the d-file.